Meeting tonight about federal spending. We'll have coverage of what, if anything, that comes out of that meeting. In the meantime, here are Senate Republicans and Democrats from earlier today talking about 2011 federal spending.
Speak as in morning business for 15 minutes.
The senator, without objection, the senator is recognized for 15 minutes.
Mr. President, I rise today to express my strong concerns about the direction that Republicans and the Tea Party want to take our country, beginning with an irresponsible government shutdown simply for the sake of pursuing a social agenda, and continuing their reckless budget plan that will devastate seniors and those most vulnerable over the next decade, while rewarding millionaires with even more tax breaks. I looked at this Republican budget put out by Chairman Ryan, and it's a proposal that takes $1.5 trillion out of health care for seniors and children and gives it to the wealthiest. But it does not even limit subsidies for special corporate interests like big oil. And in so doing, it fundamentally resets our values and turns back the clock on the progress we've made to protect our parents and grandparents, seniors and children in this country, and keep the playing field reasonably level. But even before that discussion, I want to make a few things clear about the implications of shutting the government down and what we on this side have already cut from the President's budget to reach an agreement. We started this year off with $41 billion less in spending than the President requested. Plus, in March, we cut another $10 billion below last year's funding levels, including the complete elimination of 33 federal programs. In total, we have offered up $33 billion in cuts for the remainder of the current funding year, which ends in September. But the most radical elements of the Republican Party won't take yes for an answer. They say we have not come far enough, which in Tea Party terms means we haven't given them everything they want. So they'll shut the government down rather than take yes for an answer. I saw a picture, front page of one of the papers, and it said, with a Tea Party banner, it said, "Shut her down, shut her down." Well, I thought we were here to make sure we kept the government going. It's clear their real reason for shutting down the government at this point is to promote a social agenda that is not acceptable to the broader part of the country. They're willing to shut down the federal government, put our economy, our small businesses, our veterans at risk, and potentially delay tax refunds for millions of American families, all simply to make a political point and to try to impose a social agenda of a minority on the majority. Shutting down the federal government over a woman's right to choose, or the federal government's ability to enforce laws that protect our children's health, in my view, takes irresponsibility to a whole new level. Even the Speaker of the House himself has said a shutdown will, quote, end up costing more than we save. And the Speaker's right. It would cost about $8 billion every week, or 2.2% of GDP every week the government is shut down. Now, the Speaker's right on the substance, but he has not yet been willing to lead and deal with the tempest in the Tea Party on his right, threatening to cut our economic recovery short to satisfy a narrow right-wing political agenda. At a time when small businesses are just beginning to get access to capital they need to create jobs for American families, a shutdown will result in $400 million in capital each week not going to small businesses through the SBA loan program. and will throw the engine of small business job growth into neutral when we want it to be in overdrive. In the last shutdown, more than $1 million in small business loans to 5,200 businesses were delayed, so we know what small businesses are in for if we have another shutdown. Mr. President, this is not the time in our recovery efforts to say no to helping small businesses put people to work. In housing, the FHA loan process, which accounts for 30% of the housing market, will be interrupted just as we enter the height of the spring season home buying in my state of New Jersey. With prices low and so many houses on the market, this is not the time to prevent 15,000 homeowners from getting a home loan every week, more than half of which are for new home purchases that would reduce the inventory of the surplus properties. Now, unfortunately, because Social Security is a mandatory because Social Security is a mandatory funding program, seniors and the disabled will continue to receive their checks. But if we let the tempest in the Tea Party shut down the government, interruptions at the Social Security Administration could delay changes in people's benefits and payments. In just 4 days of the last shutdown, 112,000 new claims for Social Security retirement and disability benefits were not taken. Over 800,000 callers were unable to reach the Social Security Administration, and certainly in this economy, this is not a time to leave those who rely on Social Security with nothing. And with the tax season upon us, it's certainly not the right time to delay tax refunds that families are anxiously awaiting in order to make ends meet and put into the economy and help the recovery keep going. It's not the time to shut down 368 National Park Service sites, the Smithsonian, the Statue of Liberty, the monuments, museums, national parks across the country, which in the last shutdown lost 9 million visitors, and the tourism revenues to those communities. And given that our last shutdown occurred in the dead of winter, we can expect a shutdown in the midst of spring breaks and high tourist season to have a much larger impact on tourism revenues and family wallets who have already booked trips to national parks and planned visits to national monuments and museums. And to put it in context, if we shut down the government for 5 weeks, we could lose up to $1.2 billion based on the $12 billion worth of visitors brought to the national park communities last year. And if the Tea Party continues to insist on a government shutdown, military paychecks would be delayed at a time when military families are struggling with multiple deployments and struggling like everyone else to make ends meet. They'll ultimately get paid, but only when the shutdown is finished. In the last shutdown, more than 400,000 veterans saw their disability checks delayed. Now, let's not repeat that mistake when more of our wounded sons and daughters are returning home from 2 wars raging abroad every day. And if the Tea Party continues to insist on a government shutdown, clinical trials of life-saving drugs will be halted, new patients will not be accepted into clinical research programs at the National Institutes of Health. If the Tea Party continues to insist on a government shutdown, they'll put our entire economy at risk. As a matter of fact, business leaders have said that a shutdown could result in higher interest rates and chaos in the markets. Every week, 350 import licenses could be delayed, resulting in holding up billions of dollars in American exports at a time when we need those exports to help fuel the recovery. During the 1995 shutdown, $2.2 billion in U.S. exports couldn't leave the country because 1,000 export licenses could not be issued. Ivan Seidenberg, the chairman and CEO of Verizon, who is also the chairman of the Business Roundtable, said, and I quote, "I don't think any of the CEOs would welcome a government shutdown. Problems for business would run from contracts being postponed to disruptions in the supply chain. John Engler, the president of the Business Roundtable, said, quote, business would face the danger of the law of unintended consequences. Interest rates could rise and there could be turmoil in the financial markets. Now, this would all happen because Republicans being held hostage by Tea Partiers have rejected $33 billion in spending cuts for this year because they did not get all that they wanted, because they aren't getting their way on unrelated, extraneous social issues like women's reproductive rights and enforcing laws on our books to protect our children's health. They simply will not take yes for an answer, because yes on spending cuts isn't really their only goal. Spending cuts is not why they are trying to shut the government down. I would remind our colleagues that democratic governments are not about total victory. Authoritarian governments do that, not democracies. In democracies, we are all fairly elected to represent our constituents. We all have a view. We all have a vote. We all have an obligation to govern and legislate for every American, not just for those who hold the views of the Tea Party. With all due respect, Mr. President, Tea Partiers claim to love our right to free speech and yet clearly don't believe anyone's views other than their own are acceptable. I would say to our colleagues, we all have deeply held beliefs. Defending them and shouting them from the rooftops is easy, but listening to those who disagree with us and working on the differences is the hard work of government. I would remind my colleagues on the other side that the word Congress is derived from a Latin verb meaning to walk together. We have already made cuts to the President's budget. We have already made real cuts in this year's spending. We've offered reasonable compromise that seeks even more cuts, but more importantly, a compromise that seeks common ground, not capitulation, and neither should our colleagues expect capitulation. All we ask is that those on the other side do what's right and act in the broader interests of the nation, not shut down the government, disrupt services, put the economic recovery at risk, all to satisfy a narrow political agenda. Now, I know there was a lot of fanfare on the Republican budget proposal that was put out as we look to the next fiscal year. In my view, it is by far one of the most partisan, ideological, and fundamentally destructive budgets I have seen in my time in Congress, destructive of fundamental protections for every American and for what we've come to accept as fundamental protections that are uniquely American. It fundamentally takes $1.5 trillion out of health care for seniors and children, and it gives it to the wealthy. It would take health care from seniors and children rather than take subsidies from special corporate interests like big oil companies. If Republicans got their way, New Jersey residents would lose $34 billion in health benefits, and almost 400,000 New Jerseyans would see their coverage cut entirely. The Republican proposal talks about cutting taxes, but in reading it, I find only two groups whose taxes would be cut: the rich and those who are even richer. Corporations and millionaires, or those soon-to-be millionaires, will keep all of their recent tax giveaways and would actually see their tax rate slashed by 30%. Now, this proposal loses $700 billion on the revenue side over the next 10 years by extending the Bush tax cuts, particularly to the wealthiest in the country, and trillions more by slashing tax rates for corporations and millionaires. Those making more than $1 million a year will see tax cuts of $125,000 each from the tax cuts, and tens of thousands of dollars more from proposed rate cuts, while people in my state would lose $34 billion in health benefits and 400,000 New Jerseyans end up without health coverage at all. This budget proposal shifts the balance to the wealthy, making cuts that do not reflect our values as a people and as a nation. And at the top of the list of draconian Republican cuts is Medicare. Let's for a moment look at the logic of the Republican budget proposal when it comes to Medicare, a program that since 1965 has protected seniors and made sure no older American would be without health care when they need it the most. In 1965, we passed Medicare. Why? Because senior citizens could not get health insurance. And the reason health insurance companies would not take the risk of insuring older Americans who logically would need to see doctors and receive treatment more often than younger Americans is rather clear. And even if there was such a plan, the cost would be prohibitive for a senior on a fixed income. So we created Medicare, and today it is one of our most successful programs, and no senior is left without access to life-saving, life-enhancing drugs or the care that they need. Now, what are the Republicans proposing in this budget? They're proposing to end Medicare as we know it. In fact, they want to privatize Medicare. And they say their privatization plan is just a way of asking wealthier seniors to pay more. But let's ask ourselves logically, how much do we think an insurance company will charge in premiums to a 65-year-old American male who may have had a heart attack or a heart ailment or suffers from diabetes? How outrageous do we suppose the premium will be? And how much of a voucher will that 65-year-old American need to purchase even a minimal health care plan? Mr. President, that logic escapes me. Today, buying a private plan on the open market for a self-employed middle-aged couple can cost as much as $18,000 a year. The average retiree in America is living on about $19,000 a year. So again, the logic escapes me. The fact is, this proposed privatization plan for Medicare completely overlooks the history of why we needed Medicare in the first place. It illogically assumes insurance companies will provide quality health care coverage at a huge discount to older Americans. Mr. President, if that isn't wishful thinking, I don't know what is. So let me close by simply saying it is time to make sure this government stays open. It is time to make sure we don't thrust the economy backwards, and it is time to ultimately ensure that those who have given service to this country, like the men and women in uniform, don't get hurt. And that we do by coming together on a reasonable budget. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that there be a period of morning business until 5 p.m. with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
I could not agree more that we should not have a government shutdown. I could not agree more that we need to take steps to protect and improve our economy. And I could not agree more that we need to take steps to make sure that our brave uniformed men and women are fairly compensated and otherwise treated. I must, however, express my profound, albeit respectful, disagreement with my colleague, the junior senator from New Jersey. This is not a possible shutdown that we're facing as a result of the Republican Party or as a result of the Tea Party. As a lifelong Republican and as a founding member of the Senate Tea Party caucus, I can tell you unequivocally that there is not one member of this body, nor is there one member of the Senate Tea Party caucus who wants a government shutdown, certainly no Republican. Republicans have, from the outset of this, attempted to bring forward proposals to make sure that we don't get into a shutdown. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why does the President of the United States, President Barack Obama, want a government shutdown? Let's ask a few questions. Why was it that a few months ago, after the election, but before the new Congress took over, when the President had both houses of Congress under the control of his party, why did he opt not to pass a full budget for fiscal year 2011? That was the first seed that he sowed in the direction of a government shutdown. I submit that it was one that was either irresponsible on the one hand or deliberate and malicious on the other, intending to bring about a sequence of events that would culminate inevitably in a government shutdown. Number two, even after the new Congress convened, after the balance of power shifted completely in the House of Representatives and after a number of seats in this body shifted, the new Congress convened in January of this year, the President didn't bring forward something that could attract both houses of Congress to approve and that he could fund the government with for the balance of the year. He instead chose to operate on a series of continuing resolutions. We're now moving up against what I believe will be our 7th continuing resolution, if it's passed. What we have from the President is radio silence in the direction of what we need to do to move forward. A number of us have suggested all along in this process that at a point in time in America when we have a national debt approaching $15 trillion, at a point in time when we're adding to that debt at a staggering rate approaching $1.7 trillion a year, it doesn't make sense and it isn't responsible to continue, even in small increments, perpetuating that degree of reckless, perpetual deficit spending. And so what we want to see more than anything isn't any specific set of social issue legislation. It's not any specific degree of spending cuts. It is instead a plan, some plan, that will move us in the direction of a balanced budget, that will put us
10:30 p.m. with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
And, Madam President, that the morning business be for debate only.
Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from Illinois.
I rise to speak in morning business, even though it's the evening. It's the nature of the Senate rules and procedure. But during the course of the day, we've had a number of colleagues coming to the floor talking about the looming shutdown of the federal government. During the last several hours, as we've spoken, the leaders, Majority Leader of the Senate, Harry Reid, and Speaker of the House, John Boehner, have been meeting with President Obama. It's my sincere hope that it's been a productive, fruitful meeting and that they will report to us soon that we've found a way out of this difficulty. I certainly hope that's the case. But if it's not, if we are destined to see this government shut down tomorrow night at midnight, it is a sad commentary, one that most American voters will resent and be disappointed with, and understandably so. It basically says that people who are leaders today have been unable to reach an agreement. Fingers of blame will be pointed in both directions, and the public can reach their conclusion about who is responsible. From my point of view, having worked with Senator Harry Reid on this from the beginning, attended many meetings and heard many reports, it has been a frustrating experience because the Speaker's position in the House has changed so often. The amount of money that they wanted to cut from the budget, where it would come from, and the riders, the policy riders that were part of this conversation have been changing with each meeting. I know that Senator Reid is a patient person. I've watched him as my friend since we were both elected to the House in 1982 and as my colleague in the Senate now for this my third term. And I know he's a patient person, but I know he's been frustrated because of these changing scenarios. The most recent change is one that I find most troubling, and that is that it appears that the debate is no longer over deficit reduction. It's no longer over spending cuts. It really isn't about how much money we're going to cut during the remainder of this year. Most Americans thought that was what we were debating and negotiating. It turns out now that it has really devolved into a debate over policy questions that have nothing to do directly, maybe even indirectly, with the budget deficit that we face or the money we're going to spend. For example, Speaker Boehner has been insisting today that the Senate adopt a provision which removes the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency when it comes to issues involving pollution. I disagree with that position, but I have to say to the Speaker, he should check the congressional record. It's not the most exciting publication, but if he looks at yesterday's congressional record, he will find that we spent most of yesterday debating this very topic. In fact, 4 different amendments were offered by Democrats and Republicans, including Senator McConnell, the Republican minority leader, on this issue. We debated them for days and voted yesterday on the question of the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency. There were 4 votes. On the first vote, there were 7 senators voting in favor of the change in that amendment. The second amendment, 7 senators again. The third amendment, 12 senators voted in favor of the change. And the fourth, offered by Senator McConnell, was 50-50. At the end of the day, none of the amendments passed. So for Speaker Boehner to insist now that we include in our bill a provision which has already been debated largely in the Senate and rejected is fundamentally unfair and goes way beyond any question about deficit reduction and cutting spending. The second item that he's raised is one that is even more puzzling. For some reason, the Republican majority in the House believes that the last election was a referendum on whether we provide medical services to women in America. We have a Title X program, primarily there for low-income women, that gives them access to basic health care, to the type of cancer screening and infection screening that we want all of the women in America to have access to. The House Republicans have decided that we should eliminate that federal commitment and close the clinics, denying access to millions of Americans to basic primary health care. How can that be in the best interest of our country and the cost that we incur to provide medical services? How can it be fair to these people, the women and men, who use these clinics because they're accessible and affordable? They want to close them down. I don't recall that debate in the last election. I don't remember any candidate for the House or Senate saying, I want to go to Washington and close down access to health care for women, children, and men across America. That's, in fact, what they're saying now is the reason why we need to close down the government. They think it's better to close down the government than to continue access to medical care for women under Title X in agencies like Planned Parenthood, which has a clinic in my hometown of Springfield, Illinois. For the record, Planned Parenthood and any clinic operating under Title X is prohibited from using any federal funds for the purposes of abortion. The only exceptions are those that have been in the law and accepted by both political parties for decades, the so-called Hyde Amendment, for women who are victims of rape, incest, or their lives are at stake in a continued pregnancy. Now, this isn't an abortion issue. It's obviously a health care issue, and for some reason, the House Republicans would rather close down the government than allow this kind of health service to continue. That is troublesome. It's also troubling that the underlying House budget that they passed has been judged by economists to be a job killer. 700,000 jobs would be lost if the Republicans had passed their budget and the Senate had approved it. At a time when we were celebrating the creation of over 200,000 new jobs last Friday and the lowest unemployment rate in 24 months, here come the Republicans with a budget proposal which will cost us 700,000 jobs, pushing us back toward the recession instead of away from it. That isn't sensible. And I don't believe the American people ever considered that part of the bargain in the last election. It is true the American people are focused on the deficit and cutting spending, and we are too, on both sides of the aisle. That's why we've reached an agreement on the amount of money to be cut from the remaining part of this budget. But for us to now face a shutdown of the federal government over the question of women's access to health care, or whether we're going to accept an Environmental Protection Agency change, which has already been rejected on the floor of the Senate, shows the unreasonable level of this debate. We had a meeting today of the Democratic senators, and John Kerry spoke, and I told him afterwards that what he said had a profound impact on me. He reminded us that what we're doing isn't just being observed by politicians on Capitol Hill or reporters and journalists in Washington. It's being watched by the world. It's a sad commentary that this great nation, this United States of America, with its government, has reached a point where we face closure. We know that we can do better, and it's unfortunate that the House Republicans, with their new leadership facing growing pains, have really brought us to this moment. I hope that we can reach a point where we can find an agreement even now. I hope this evening there will be a breakthrough. They said that last week when the Speaker announced to his Republican caucus in the House that there was going to be a shutdown of the government, there was a standing ovation cheering the idea of shutting down the government. I'm not going to cheer that. That's a bad outcome. It's bad for taxpayers. It's bad for our nation. It's bad for the federal employees who are performing essential services in North Carolina and Illinois and all across the world. These are men and women who are working to keep us safe. They are performing important duties like watching dangerous prisoners, making certain that our planes take off and land safely. And to even jeopardize for a minute the funding for these agencies is irresponsible to the extreme. Let's hope that there's an agreement. If not, let's hope that we can somehow extend the functions of government and not close them down at midnight tomorrow evening. At this moment, there is no report. There is likely to be one later. But I will, at this point, yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the call quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I've just returned from the White House. We've narrowed the issues significantly. However, we've not yet reached an agreement. In 26 hours and 15 minutes, the government closes if we don't work something out very quickly. So I repeat, we've narrowed the issues. We've not yet reached an agreement. We're going to work throughout the night to attempt to resolve the remaining issues, and the remaining issues are extremely, extremely narrow. But having said that, I've been to this podium before. I've been out speaking to the press before, and I've said we've narrowed the issues, and we have. But the sad part about it, we keep never quite getting to the finish line. So I hope that we can work through the night to get this done. The President set an early morning deadline, and before we have to start notifying almost 1 million federal employees that they'll have to report to work and say they won't be there on Monday. It's a technical thing they have to do. And they have to do it tomorrow before closing time. So we need to try to work toward that deadline. I'm hopeful we can get that done. I'm not really confident, but I'm very, very hopeful.
Madam President,
The senator from Illinois.
I understand the Senate has received H.R. 658 from the House under the previous order. I ask that the Senate proceed to that measure.
Pursuant to the order of February 17, 2011, all after the enacting clause is stricken and the text of S-223 as passed is inserted in lieu thereof, and the bill as amended shall be read a third time.
H.R. 658, an act to amend Title 49, United States Code, and so forth, and for other purposes.
The clerk shall read the PAYGO statement.
This is the statement of budgetary effects of PAYGO legislation for H.R. 658 as amended. Total budgetary effects of H.R. 658 for the 5-year statutory PAYGO scorecard, net reduction in the deficit of $17.796 billion. Total budgetary effects of H.R. 658 for the 10-year statutory PAYGO scorecard, net reduction in the deficit of $19.467 billion. Also submitted for the record as part of this statement is a table prepared by the Congressional Budget Office which provides additional information on the budgetary effects of this act.
Under the previous order, the bill as amended is passed. The motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The Senate insists upon its amendment request. The Senate insists upon its amendment, requests a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair appoints the following as conferees on the part of the Senate.
Senators Rockefeller, Boxer, Nelson of Florida, Cantwell, Hutchison, Ensign, DeMint, and from the Committee on Finance, Senators Baucus and Hatch.
Madam President,
The senator from Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Resolution 136 submitted earlier today.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 136 to authorize document production in United States v. Douglas D. Hampton.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motions to reconsider be laid upon the table, with no intervening action or debate, and any statements related to the resolution be placed in the record at the appropriate places if read.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate now proceed to consideration of Senate Resolution 137, which was submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 137 supporting the goals and ideals of Take Our Daughters and Sons to Work Day.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the following bill be placed on the calendar, H.R. 1363.
Without objection, so ordered.
I understand there's a bill at the desk, and I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
S-768, a bill to provide for continuing operations of government in a fiscally responsible manner.
I now ask for a second reading, and in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I object to my own request.
Objection is heard. The bill will be read for the second time in the next legislative day.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today and adjourn until 11 a.m. on Friday, April 8th, that following the prayer and pledge, the Journal of Proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. The Senate proceed to a period of morning business until 4 p.m. for debate only, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, and that any time spent in quorum call be equally divided.
Without objection.
Madam President, we're hopeful we can reach an agreement on the budget tomorrow. Senators will be notified when votes are scheduled. And, Madam President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 11 a.m. on Friday, April the 8th, 2011.
So the Senate's gambled out, but all day today, members came to the floor to discuss the ongoing negotiations taking place between congressional leaders and the White